our webinar. Thank you for joining us again. This time we don't have a Power BI webinar. It's a different webinar. We are pleased to have Reza Dorrani, Microsoft MVP in Power Apps, talking about Power Apps today, building performant Power Apps. I first met him, I think, while we've been in one of the community summits. It previously used to be called something else, right? It used to be called
Yep.
Dynamic
Well, it was some
Community,
dynamic summit, right?
yeah, summit in Orlando. It was great experience, and I don't usually have the chance to have another Reza presenting while I'm sitting here. He's a great presenter, and he's doing his job phenomenal. He has a YouTube channel that has a lot of interesting videos about Power Apps, and the latest one actually was like Power Apps and Power BI using like direct query approach CDS, which is quite fantastic. Okay, that's probably enough for me talking. If you have any questions during the presentation, feel free to write it in the chat window. We'll get to your questions at the end of the presentation. And that's me. Here you go, Reza. Can you please introduce yourself and start sharing your screen?
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Reza, for having me. Yeah, it sounds weird, right? Reza introducing Reza. So thank you so much for having me. Of course, I'm talking to Reza Rad, who's I call him Reza Power BI. You can call me Reza Power Apps. So let's kind of distinguish between the two. But yeah, I'm a big fan of Reza Rad, of course. He is the Power BI guru, as we all know, and I'm very excited to be here today and talking about Power Apps, which is one of the aspects in Power Platform that I am very passionate about. And our topic today is related to Power Apps, of course, but we are going to focus primarily on the performance aspects of building Power Apps. So let's get started with the presentation for today. I will go ahead and share my screen, and Reza, just let me know when my screen is visible.
Yep, it is all visible.
All right, so let's get started. So today's topic is building performant Power Apps. My name, of course, Reza Dorrani, Business Apps MVP, leader of the Houston Power Platform user group, and a very active blogger and speaker in the community. The learning objectives for this webinar is purely around performance of Power Apps, and we will look at the different optimization techniques that you can leverage and make tweaks in your existing apps to ensure the performance of your app scales. So before I begin with anything, I always talk about the why. Why are we talking about performance? Why should we worry about performance in Power Apps? The answer to the why is actually in the what. So let's first find out what is Power Apps. So Power Apps, and this is based upon the textbook definition in docs.microsoft.com. Power Apps is a suite of app services, connectors that allows you to rapidly build applications that are mobile ready, and of course, low code development experience. Now, the three key points in the what that I want all of us to focus on is number one is connectors. Number two is mobile. Number three is low code. These are three key points that we need to consider purely because performance does have an impact related to these 3 points. Now let's break down these 3 points one by one. Connectors is how the data is connected to in your apps. So when you build your app, you need to connect to your data source. When you connect to your data source, you do so through data connectors, just like how you do in Power BI. The connector in turn actually goes ahead and performs the query on your behalf based upon the criteria that you've defined when connecting to your data in your Power App. Because the connector talks to a data source, of course, there is a query at the back end associated with that data source. And that query, it's very important to understand this, that query that is being performed by the connector has to be in an optimized manner. The second key point around what is Power Apps is designed with the mobile experience in mind. In order for you to run Power Apps on your mobile devices, there is a mobile app available for you in the App Store, no matter which device you have, and you can install that app and run your apps on your devices. Now think about this. Power Apps is designed for the mobile experience. If I am running my app on a mobile device, and if I'm performing a query against my data source, what if my network connection is poor? What if I am fetching large amounts of data from the data source in my app? What implications will it have based on the storage space that I have in my device? And the other question is, how much processing power does my mobile device have? So these are a lot of important factors that have been considered by the product teams themselves when they have designed Power Apps. But we need to think about this as well. Connectors, mobile, and at the end of the day, not just Power Apps, but the entire Power Platform is marketed as the low-code development experience, which is true. But even though it is low-code, you as the app maker, because in this case, we are purely focusing on Power Apps, so you as the Power App maker have to take into consideration the performance and optimization of your app. This is not going to be handled for you automatically. Now, this slide purely showcases how in Power Apps, when you make a request through a specific data connector, how does that request flow? So when the user makes a request, there is an open data protocol API call that takes place, and that goes out to Azure API management, which in turn routes it to the connector management, which in turn routes it to the specific data source in question. That data source could be SharePoint, SQL, CDS, no matter what your data source is. Based upon the connector, we'll go ahead, fetch the data, get it back, and finally give it out to the user. So of course, when you are leveraging the connector, whether you realize this or not, at the back end, there are these OData calls or REST API calls that are taking place. Now that we've understood that Power Apps is meant for low code, it's meant for the mobile experience, and there are queries that are being performed, that means definitely we need to take into account how optimized our queries are. Now let's look at the different concepts in Power Apps that an app maker has to be aware of in order to design apps that are performant and in order to design apps that scale as your data source grows. The first concept is the concept of delegation. Whenever you are dealing with data sources that have large amounts of data, you have to understand the concept of delegation in Power Apps. Once again, what is delegation? Delegation, as the name itself suggests, is the ability of Power Apps to delegate the work of processing the query against your underlying data source to the data source. That means if I am querying SQL, and if I perform a specific SQL query, that query needs to be performed by the data source and not Power Apps. If Power Apps has to get all the data from your data source and perform the query, you can imagine the impact that will have on the performance, especially working on a mobile device. So delegation, once again, means Power Apps does not have to do the work. The data source would rather do the work on behalf of Power Apps and send the response back to Power Apps. Now, of course, there is something known as delegation, but what if data source is not able to do the work? What if the data source cannot delegate the query that Power Apps has asked for. In that case, Power Apps has to do the work. Now, if Power Apps has to do the work, there is a limit to the amount of data Power Apps can hold in memory in order to perform that query. And that limit is the number 500. By default, whenever you create an app, there is a setting in Power Apps, and by default, that number in this setting is 500. That means if Power Apps is performing a query that it cannot delegate to the data source, in that case, Power Apps can only handle 500 records. Now I can increase that to 2000, and that's the maximum limit that has been set in Power Apps. Let's take an example. If I have a data source and that data source, let's say, has 5,000 records, and if I perform a query against that data source, let's say my query says, get me all the records that have been modified in the last 10 days. Out of those 5,000 items, let's say 10 items have been modified in the last 30 days. When I perform this query, ideally you want the data source to perform this query, so it happens server side and the result is coming back to Power Apps. But in a scenario in which that query is not delegable, Power Apps has to do the work. And guess what Power Apps will do? Power Apps will look at the delegation setting. It could be 500. You could bump this up to 2000 at max. So let's say my scenario is 500. Power Apps will query the data source. Just get the first 500 items. That's it. Just get the first 500 items. Bring all those items in memory within the app, and then perform the query that you have executed. That means it will get the first 500 records, completely ignore the remaining set of records, and then perform my query to check to see which items have been modified in the last 30 days. That means I will not get accurate results purely because Power Apps has bypassed a lot of data in the backend. This is a very, very crucial concept to understand. Now the question arises that which data sources support delegation? Currently, there are only 3 data sources that support delegation: the Common Data Service, SharePoint, and SQL. 3 data sources. Also, at the same time, I want you to observe this little diamond icon that I have thrown in on the screen. If you observe this, CDS and SQL have this symbol associated with them. That is because both CDS and SQL require you to have premium licensing. That means if I am planning to work with large data sources, the only 3 data source options that I have right now is CDS, SharePoint, and SQL. The only non-premium data source that is delegable as of now is SharePoint. Not promoting SharePoint. Every data source is different. Every data source has a different use case associated with it. But it is important to understand that SharePoint is the only non-delegable data source, or the only delegable data source that supports the standard licensing. And of course, if any other data source supports delegation, the connector documentation would specify that. Another important thing to understand is when you're working in Power Apps, if you're importing Excel files, those are considered as static data because all that data is imported in the app. When you import data in your app, you are storing that data within the app, in memory in the app. In that case, you don't run into delegation. But that also does not mean you upload millions of records into the app, because in that scenario, the mobile devices where these apps would be running need to have enough bandwidth and enough memory to perform well. Now, it's not just the data sources that need to support delegation. Even the functions within those data sources decide whether or not delegation is supported or not. Okay, so it looks like delegation is a very important concept. We need to understand this concept. 3 data sources support delegation, and it also depends upon the functions that I am calling. Fair enough. But what if I have built an app today? How do I identify that my current app has any delegation warnings. There are 4 ways in which you can do so. The first option is the Power Apps checker. The second option is you can look for these blue dot errors in formulas. The third option is you can look for this hazard-like symbol in your screen. And number 4, you can change that delegation setting that I showcased earlier to 1. If you set this delegation setting to 1, you will never see more than 1 record when you perform a query that is not delegable. That will clearly give you a visual cue as to the data that is being returned is only 1 record. That means your query is not delegable. The most important point of this slide right now is the last point. The responsibility of handling delegation is on the maker of the app. Delegation is not an error, it is a warning. That means I can have an app that I publish. I can have an app that my enterprise leverages, uses on a day-to-day basis that has delegation warnings. Everybody will be working on the app. Everybody can leverage the app. There is no issue. But at the same time, the users may get false positive results purely because if query in question is not delegable, Power Apps will only work on the first 500 records. So in cases of large data sets, you will get false results. Now let's look at a demo of delegation. Now in my scenario, I will go ahead and open up a Power App that I have pre-created. And this Power App talks to SharePoint as a data source, just for this demo purpose. And this data source right here has a list called students that has approximately 604 records. So I have a list. It has 600 records in my backend data source, which is SharePoint. Now, please note SharePoint, SQL, CDS, they can have up to millions of records in them. You need to be aware of this fact, but past the delegation limit. So how do I work around? Can I have an app that I build that can handle millions of records? And the answer is yes, as long as your app does not have any delegation warnings. Now, in my case, I've gone ahead and fired the app.
Sorry, Reza, to interrupt. We hear like a little bit like disconnecting your voice. If you have your camera on, can you turn it off so we have a better sound quality?
Let me go ahead and do just that.
Thank you.
Is it better now?
Should be better. Yep. Please go on.
All right.
I think. Yep.
Okay.
That looks better. Yep.
All right. So in this application right now, I have a very simple app that's connected to that SharePoint list called students. It's the same list that I just showcased right here. This list has over 600 records. And on my home screen, I have this very, very simple gallery control that displays all the records from my data source. I have a search box here that I can search for students within this gallery. Now, all this data is coming from my data source. And the first thing I want you to observe is if I go to the gallery and if I look at the items property of this gallery, the items property of this gallery, let's go to advanced, let's go to items, let's open this. Let's remove this. Reza, can you hear me fine? Just confirming. Okay, as long as you can hear me fine.
Yep.
All right. So the items property of this gallery is coming from that same data source, which is students. Now, in this case, I do not have any delegation warning. Now, how do I know about that? Well, let's create a scenario first, which has a delegation warning. So let me go ahead and change my query. And in this case, I am filtering the data from my data source, where the text that I enter in the search box is in the title property of my data source. Now, the first thing I want you to observe is I'm getting all those 4 queues that I specified for delegation. Queue number 1, and I'm going to try and zoom right here. you will see the hazard symbol right here. That means I have a delegation warning in the screen. Cue number 2, I can go to the app checker. If I head over to formulas right here on the warning, it clearly tells me that there is a delegation warning. Cue number 3, if I look at the query in action right here, I get this little blue dot error in my formula right here that clearly says that there is a delegation warning right here. And cue number 4, I can always go to settings of my app, and by default, this first setting for non-delegable queries would be 500. If I change this to 1, and if I go back to my app, you will notice that in some time this will change to 1 item. That's because the delegation limit that I have set for my app is 1. Previously it was 5, that's why it's showing me 5 items right here. Now this is a delegation error. That means Power Apps has to do the work. And if Power Apps has to do the work, it will give you false positive results. So right now, if I try and search for a specific student, it will not give me the results purely because I can only search in these 5 records. That means I cannot work with large data sources. In order for me to work with large data sources, my query has to be delegable. So in is a function in Power Apps that performs a contains operation. There is also another function in Power Apps called starts with, which is basically checks to see if the peculiar string starts with the text that I have entered. Now, in is not a delegable function when you are working with SharePoint as a data source, whereas starts with is a delegable function. How do I know this is delegable? I don't get the blue dot error. I do not see any hazard symbol right here, and I do not see any warnings. And of course, I see more than 1 record. So as you can see, it's very, very important for you to understand that when working with large data sets, you need to make sure that there is no delegation warning. Now, for the purpose of this demo, from a delegation standpoint, I've literally just scratched the surface. If you really want to learn delegation in detail, on my YouTube channel, I have a 5-part series on delegation. I have covered various scenarios from date column types to lookup columns to choice columns to people picker fields. Every scenario is what I've tried to cover as part of this 5-track video series. So if you've never checked that out, please check that out. And hopefully that will give you a lot more insights into the different ways in which you can avoid delegation errors in your apps. All right, moving back to our presentation. So delegation is concept number 1 when working with large data sources. The next part is control optimization. In Power Apps, every time you add a control to your app, it is actually generating an HTML DOM for rendering each of those controls, whether you like it or not. And some of the controls, the special type of controls like PDF viewer, data tables, combo boxes, they actually have additional scripts that they run at the back end. Of course, adding more and more controls to the DOM means if I'm running my app on my mobile device, more and more controls need to be loaded into memory, which will definitely impact performance. In fact, the recommendation from Microsoft is don't add more than 500 controls to your app, to one app. And this is true for all the screens. So if you have 20 screens in your app, that number 500 is for all the screens in the app. It's not a per screen setting. It is just a recommendation. You can go past that number, but you will start seeing performance going down. That means you need to plan to reduce the number of controls when you are building apps. Now, how do I do this? One of the top ways for reducing the number of controls is by using galleries. A gallery is more like a repeating control that is available within Power Apps, and you can configure it to repeat certain elements. As an example, in the screenshot on the right-hand side, and I will show you this as a part of a demo as well. If you notice, in this case, I have 6 button controls that I have added. So I have 6 buttons. And all those 6 buttons are listed right here on the bottom screen. As against, I can just have 1 gallery and 1 button control, and actually go ahead and create a scenario that looks exactly like the scenario on the top. Both of them work, but the difference is the control on the top uses 6 elements on the DOM, whereas the control at the bottom uses just 2 controls. Now, yes, this might not make a big difference in one screen, but what if I have 20 screens wherein I need the same tab? Now it will start making a difference. So it's very, very important to reduce controls as much as you can. And galleries is one of the top ways of reducing controls, especially in scenarios when you're repeating things over and over again. That's number one. The second way is by using components. Now, if you've never used components before, components are reusable building blocks in Power Apps. You can create them at an app level, or you can create them at an environment level and share them. And users who are building these apps can leverage your components. Now, why does components improve my performance? Well, the concept is very similar to the gallery as well, because the component in itself is a control. It's a container. Within that container, I am setting up my building blocks. And then rather than recreating those controls over and over again, I am just adding my component, which is one block that points to the block of code that we have set up. If you have never worked with components before, I will also share links to learning components, which is very, very important. And the third tip is the form control. If you've ever used the form control in Power Apps, and you will mostly have used it for adding data or updating data in your data sources, not many people realize is that when you add that form control, every card that you add in that form control, every column that you add actually creates multiple controls. And I will show you this in the form of a demo. And many a times we tend to create multiple screens for different form types. For example, you want to create a new record in your data source, you create one screen, you add the form control. You need to edit records, you create a second screen and you add the form control. You need to view data, you add a third screen and you add the form control. However, there are ways in which you can leverage the same screen and the same form control and keep changing the mode of the form. Now, does this make a difference in terms of how the users are interacting with the app? No. But does it make a difference in performance? Absolutely yes. Because I'm not creating multiple screens and I'm not adding multiple controls. The fewer the controls, the more performant your app will get. Now let's look at a demo of these 3 cases that I just covered. Let's first talk about galleries. So in my case, I have the same example right here. I'm going to try and zoom in. I have this scenario wherein I have 6 buttons which are acting as tabs, whereas I have replaced it with a very, very simple gallery and one single control called a button. Now, if you look at the items property of the gallery, this is where I have defined the array, and this array is what gets passed to the gallery and it recreates that control for me. But in the DOM, it is only creating two controls here as against 6 controls here. Very, very important to understand. I spoke about components as the second option. This is a covered tracking application based on Power Platform that I had set up. And this is actually available in the community for you to download as well. As part of this, like you're looking at the home screen of this app right now. In this screen, I have multiple components, and let me show you all those components quickly. I have a header component. So this control on the top that has the logo, my picture, the title, this is actually one control. You see this on the left-hand side. This is just one single control called header comp home. I also have a left navigation component right here. It's just one component that drives this entire left navigation. I also have a Bing Maps component right here. I also have a chart component right here. I have 4 components that are a part of this screen. And as you scan through different screens in my app, you will notice that I'm leveraging the same components over and over again. I have my header, I have my left nav, I have my Bing Maps. And I keep using this across multiple screens. Now, where is this component being set up? I am setting this up within the app itself, and these are reusable building blocks. So for example, my left navigation has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It has 5 controls. Rather than recreating these 5 controls over and over again for these 5 screens, I just created a component and I added the component to my screen. I have saved controls. Very, very important to do that. Additionally, components provide reusability, and there are many other benefits of components. Once again, on my YouTube channel, I actually have a full playlist on components wherein I have actually showcased from scratch how I have built all these components, the left nav component, the map component, the capture component. So please go ahead and check that out as well. So components was the second answer. And the third one was, how can I use the same form control over and over again? So this is a form control right here. And within a form control, you typically have data cards. Each card has 4 additional controls, as you can see. So these are 5 controls, 5 controls, 5 controls, 5 controls. Cards are very expensive. It adds a lot of controls. If I keep adding multiple screens for multiple form types, I am adding a lot of controls to my app. Rather, I can just have buttons that I click and it changes the mode of the form. So I clicked on plus. This makes it the form mode new. If I click on edit, this performs an edit on the form control. It's the same form control, but it is changing its behavior. That is because I'm calling formulas to change the behavior of my code. Very, very important once again to understand. Do not just create screens and just add controls randomly. As an app maker, you have to be cognizant of the fact that adding controls, adding more and more controls, and specifically hitting that 500 number, you will run into performance issues. All right. Heading back to some other optimization techniques. Go ahead and share my presentation again. The next technique is the onStart function. Now, Power Apps has an onStart function that is probably the most underused function in Power Apps, according to me. The onStart function is a function that runs only once when the user navigates to the app for the first time. So please note, it only runs once. This function is the ideal function for you to perform specific operations to hold data in memory. I'll give you one very common use case, which I've shown in the screenshot right here on the right-hand side. Many a times in our apps, we go ahead and query the user profile. Many a times we do this. And we keep utilizing that query in multiple screens in your app. Now, when you perform this query, Office 365 users.myprofile, at the back end, without you realizing it, it is actually performing an OData query against the user profile. It's an expensive operation. It's a query against a service. If I keep calling this across multiple screens, as the user navigates from one screen to another, there will be a query that will be performed. Now, what are the chances of a user's profile changing during the user's session while they are viewing the app? Probably none. Why not store the user's profile in a local variable in the app? So in this case, I'm using the set function in Power Apps to store the user's profile in a variable. The advantage I get is I have one query to get the user's profile, and I only do it on start of the app. And then throughout my app, across all my screens, whenever I need to get data from the profile, I just get it from this variable. The advantage is I'm not performing multiple queries, right? That's the first advantage. Second, because this data is held locally in the app, it'll be the fastest mode for Power Apps to perform the query for me. Classic case. If there are any data sets that you want to hold in memory, you can do so as well using the collect function. So caching is a great technique, but you need to be cognizant of the fact that you don't want to cache too much data in memory as well. Another technique that you can leverage is a function in Power Apps called Concurrent. And with Concurrent, what you could do is you can run multiple queries or functions in parallel. So if you look at the screenshots right here at the bottom, both of them are performing 4 queries, right? There are 4 against a data source, and I'm loading that data in memory in a collection. Now, both of these, although they look the same, the difference is the right-hand side has the functions encapsulated under another function called concurrent. The advantage is all the functions that are listed out under concurrent will run concurrently. It's like multi-threading. Whereas on the left-hand side, because I'm executing these statements one after the other, Power Apps will first execute the first query, wait, then perform the second query, then the third, then the fourth. But if I use concurrent, it can actually multi-thread and perform all the queries for me and speed up the performance of my app. Please note, you can't just use concurrent randomly. Functions within concurrent should not have any dependency on each other. That is because these functions are running concurrently. So if one function is dependent on the other, you cannot technically run them concurrently because multi-threading will take place and you may or may not have the correct results. Another key aspect is formula optimization. Now this specifically deals with formulas and Power Apps, and one of the most common misconceptions that I have noticed a lot on the community forums, purely because I'm very active there, is many a times when we query our data source, we perform a query using the filter function, which is absolutely fine. But many a times we just want the first record of that result set. And what we typically do is we perform the query and then we use another function called first. Instead of using first and filter, I can actually replace it with another function called lookup. And lookup is exactly the same as first filter, but there is a massive difference in performance. And let me explain to you how. Now, if you look at the first query, because I'm querying first and filter, first the filter operation will be performed. So what Power Apps will do is it will see the formula. So it says filter my data source, which is students, and go and get all the students where their name begins with David. So what Power Apps will do, it will go to the data set and it will query the entire data set and get all the results back. There may be one result, there may be 5 results, there may be no results, but it will get all the results back if it finds anything. It will keep scanning the entire data set. Why? Because filter returns tabular data. Then we perform the first function on that data, and then we get the final property that we are looking out for based on the formula that you perform. Now, if I replace the same formula with lookup, the output is exactly the same, but the second one is more performant, and let me tell you why. When you perform this query using lookup, when it scans your data source, the moment it finds the item, it will stop scanning the remaining data set. That's what lookup does. Lookup knows that it has to only return one data. So the moment it finds that matching criteria, it will send the response back to Power Apps. It's a big difference in performance. If I have 1,000,000 records here, and if I perform a query like this, as against a query like this, you will see a massive difference in performance. Another one is, of course, use variables. And I kind of showed this earlier. Don't keep querying every time when you're performing formulas. For example, I need the email of the user and I need to use it in a query. User.email. This is a query against the user profile service. Don't do this. Store it in a variable. The user's email is never going to change during that user session. Store it in a variable on the onstart of your app and leverage it to perform the query. It'll be a lot more performant. It'll be a lot more smoother. Another feature that the Power Apps team introduced without anybody realizing, of course, is a preview feature that is turned on by default, and that is known as delayed load. This has been documented, but not many people know about this. Delayed load ensures that only the controls bound to the screen are visible. That means if I have an app with 20 screens, when the user is on screen 1, only the controls specific to screen 1 will be loaded in memory. So this was not the case before. This is a new feature that has been introduced, and by default, this is turned on. If you have any apps that you have built and that are older apps, I would highly recommend you to go back to those apps, go to the settings and turn this feature on. Another feature is control dependency. Many a times we create dependencies between controls. For example, I have a color property that I like from one label in one screen, and in order to reuse it in other screens, we refer it to the same property of that label in a different screen. That's called control dependency. One control being dependent on a property of another control in another screen. If you create scenarios that result in control dependency, in that case, both the screens will be loaded in memory. So even though you have that delayed load feature turned on that I showcased earlier, because one control in my screen references one control in a different screen, both the screens will be loaded in memory at the same time. That will result in a decrease in performance. How do I get around it? Again, use variables, use variables, use variables. N+1 query. Now, what is N+1? Many a times we leverage the gallery control, which is kind of the repeating control in Power Apps. And within that gallery control, we actually go ahead and perform another query. So let's say I have a gallery, and in this gallery, I need to fetch the information of the current student's teacher. So what we do is we go ahead and we perform another query for every item of that gallery against the teacher's table. Now, the problem is, if my gallery has, let's say, 500 records, then for every record that it is loading, there is a query being performed against the database. And that's what is called N+1. Do not create scenarios like these. These are very expensive operations in Power Apps. It might work well when you're designing an app and the app has only 500 records. It might work very well. The moment your data starts growing, your performance will start nose diving down. Even though you have delegation turned on, you will still see a decrease in performance because you're performing multiple queries for every item in that gallery. So please, please do not create scenarios like these. Another feature is called delay output on text controls. And this I will show you in the form of a demo because I think it'll be much more clearer to explain it in the form of a demo. Avoid repeating formulas. Don't repeat the same formula over and over again. I kind of showcased this earlier. So let's look at a demo now of all the different elements that I just showcased. So I'm going to head back to Power Apps and go back to my app. First thing is, let's look at what delayed output for a text control does. So let's go to delay output. Okay. Now in this case, I have a very simple text box. As I start typing things here, so let's say I say Reza Dorrani. Notice that as I type and the moment I wait, it puts the value right here, right? Check this out. Reza Rad. You see, the moment I stop typing, it puts the label value in there. That is because I have a feature turned on for this text box called delay output. It's true. If I turn this to false, if I change this to false, and if I play this app, now notice what happens. As I type, it will plug the value in there. Reza Dorrani. Okay, so delayed output just delays the output. Fair enough, but what's the benefit of this? Let me show you the true benefit of this. Let's say I have a screen wherein I have a gallery right here that I'm filtering based on the student name that I enter right here. Now, if I have the delay output property set to true, right? Or let's say I set this to false. If I set this to false, the moment I type every character, it is actually performing a query against my data source. Every character that I type. Why? Because every time I'm typing, it is recording it and the data source is being queried. I wrote the name Anjali right now, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 characters. Without me realizing, it performed 6 queries at the back end. Do you really need that? Probably not. Turn delay output to true. And now if I change this, or if I just remove this, and if I type the same query again, let's say I search for John, John. The moment I stop typing, it will perform the query. Now it just performed one query. It's a very small thing, but it makes a very, very big difference in the performance of your apps. Another use case that I will probably cover is concurrent. So in this case, I have a sequential button that when I click this button, it loads all of this data in collections. I have another button that performs exactly the same scenario, but it is decorated with the concurrent function, as you can see right here. Now let's see what's the difference. If I hit this, and if I hit concurrent, notice the difference in timing. I know it's very, very minimal right now, purely because my data set is very small. But if you're dealing with millions of records, you will notice a big difference in performance. This took 0.09 milliseconds, I believe, and this took 0.04. Concurrent is a lot more faster, purely because all those functions are running concurrently. Another aspect that I want to cover is the n+1 query. Now in this scenario, I have a list in my gallery of students. One of the properties that I have, or one of the labels that I have out here, is the teacher. Now notice right here, I am performing a query against my data source. My data source is called class. I have imported that right here. Here's my data source from SharePoint, a list called class. I am querying based on the current item in the gallery to get the class teacher. Now, if I play this app, in reality, what is happening at the back end for every item that's a part of this gallery, it is actually performing a query. You don't need to do things like that. What you could do is you could rather load that class in a collection. So what do I mean by that? If I head back to this gallery, and if we look at the items property of this gallery, it's coming from students. And if we look at this specific label in the gallery, rather than querying the data source, what if I query something that I've stored in my local cache? And this is called collection. I've loaded that data in a collection. Now the performance would be a lot better because I'm not querying my data source, rather I'm querying the local cache that is available in Power Apps. And how did I store that? Well, on visible of my screen, I loaded the data from class into a collection. The advantage is now that all these queries are being performed for every item, these queries will be performed against the local cache, not against my data source. Querying the data source, it's a very expensive operation. You need to be aware of that fact. All right. Heading back to my presentation once again. Last two important points. One is republishing apps. This is probably one of the most misused and underutilized concepts. The Power Apps product team frequently makes changes to the backend and provides a lot of performance improvements. If you need those performance improvements, you need to keep republishing your apps. One of the recommendations is to republish your apps every 6 months. If you've ever looked at versioning in apps, there is a note that's provided right here on the top. It says, it's only possible to restore versions that were created in the last 6 months. So if you've ever built an app, and if you haven't republished that app in the last 6 months, please go ahead and do that. One, it will give you performance benefits because there have been a lot of updates that have been made depending upon the Power Apps release versions. Second, if you ever make a mistake while making changes to the app, you can always go back to the previous version, if that version has been published in the last 6 months. If you have not published that version in the last 6 months, you will not be able to restore it. One last piece is file optimization. Many a times we add images, video files, audio files to our app, and typically we do not take into consideration the size of those files. Please make sure that you compress those files. You can use some of these links that I'm showcasing right here to go ahead and reduce the file sizes while you're uploading them to Power Apps. Please note Power Apps has a limit, and that limit is highlighted right here. It's a 200 meg storage limit. That does not mean you try and hit that limit. The more files you add, the more data the app has to load in memory. Imagine this happening on a mobile device that does not have great RAM. In that case, the performance will again start getting impacted. So please make sure you perform optimization of files before loading them into memory. To wrap it up, key takeaways. Number one, very important. Understand the concept of delegation when working with large data sources. If you do not understand delegation and you are an app maker, you are making a big mistake purely because your app is going to get published, but users will get false positive results. Use caching wherever and whenever possible, right? For example, user's profile. Cache it in memory when the app loads and use that. Don't keep querying it over and over again. Reduce the number of queries, reduce the number of network calls, N+1 effect. Avoid control dependencies. Don't create a control on one screen and then create a label in another screen that gets the text from that control in the first screen. Don't create scenarios like that purely because you're creating dependencies between controls. That means Power Apps will load both the screens in memory at once. Reduce controls. Do not go beyond that 500 number. How do you reduce controls? Use galleries, use components. Republish your apps regularly. Power Apps is a growing service. It keeps getting updates regularly, in fact, on a daily basis. So please make sure you keep republishing your apps. Learning materials. If you would like to deep dive further, there are some really good performance tips that's available on docs.microsoft.com. In fact, 70 to 80% of the tips that I covered as part of this presentation are available right there on docs.microsoft.com as well. Also, there was a blog post out by Mehdi Salahuddin, who is one of the product members in Microsoft. He put out a very good blog post around performance considerations. And there is also a masterclass video, masterclass webinar that he did. So I would highly recommend you to go and check that out. I learned a lot from those webinars. So please do check them out. And finally, thank you, Reza, for giving me the opportunity for coming on Radicad's channel and presenting on Power Apps. Very interesting. And I hope this was useful. And for folks who would like to connect with me, these are my details. It's my YouTube channel, and I'm very active on Twitter as well. Thank you.
Great. Fantastic. Thanks for the awesome presentation. Reza, I see some people enjoyed it in the chat window. I get some feedback. We got a few questions.
Sure.
Like one of them, can we fetch more than 5,000 records using SharePoint as a data source? I believe yes, but
100%.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
100% yes, you can fetch more than 5,000 records. But please note that SharePoint itself has a limit as well. If you are a person who's worked on SharePoint, you will know that SharePoint has a 5,000 threshold limit for views. That means if Power Apps has to perform a query that returns more than 5,000 results, if SharePoint cannot handle it, Power Apps cannot handle it. Now, how do you work around that in SharePoint? You create indexed columns in SharePoint. If you create an indexed column in SharePoint, Power Apps will be able to perform that query for you. I have created a scenario like this for one of my customers wherein we have the SharePoint list right now has 350K records, and Power Apps performs the query within half a second. That's purely because all of my queries are delegable, and I have also understood that SharePoint itself has limitations and you need to perform those indexed queries.
Great, thank you. Another question from Shivam again. Is there a limit for records to fetch in dropdown or combo box?
Is there a limit? Yes, drop downs do have a limit. Combo box also does have a limit. Typically, if you have a scenario wherein you have a lot of items, let's say you have 10,000 items and the users have to select that in a combo box, don't use a combo box in that scenario. Go ahead and use a gallery. Don't use a combo box. Take them to a different screen. Let them search for the items there. Select the items in the gallery and get it back to your previous screen. It'll be a lot more performant.
Perfect. Thank you. And one last question. Are components now usable in scrolling screens?
Are components usable in scrolling screens? The answer is yes, because I don't know if you focused on that demo that I gave, my screens were actually scrollable. So answer is yes. One thing about components though, they are still in preview. So can you use them in production scenarios? I would probably wait until it goes into general availability. But if you're an organization that have invested heavily in Power Apps, I would highly recommend you to start investing in components so that when it goes into GA, your components are ready to roll.
Perfect. Thank you. That was pretty much all the questions. Thank you again for the great presentation. We get a lot of feedback. Thanks, Reza Power App, about that.
Reza Power App.
And Reza Power BI for hosting. So that's a that's a great way of putting that together. Do you have any last word to say?
Yeah, I think I need to turn my camera off because my network's not that great.
No, it was
I
good.
do have.
Yeah, it was good to have your camera on if you keep it on.
So my parting thought is for folks who are working with Power Apps, please consider performance. Performance is very, very important. Yes, anybody can build an app. Yes, Power Apps is low code. This is my saying. Anybody can build an app, but not everyone can build a performant app. You need to understand performance. And for that, you need to understand all the concepts that I highlighted today. So please keep that in the back of your mind. If you're new app developers or if you've built a lot of apps before, go back to your apps, check if you have delegation warnings, see if you can apply these tweaks and make your apps work faster.
Perfect.
That's my parting thoughts. And thank you, Reza, for having me on your channel. It was a pleasure coming here.
Thank you. Thanks for your time. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And we'll see you all next week with the next presentation. And we'll let you go to enjoy the rest of your day, Reza.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.